There is a moment near the end of this story that is difficult to describe without giving too much away. A man named Moon Baek sat in a concrete stairwell with his right knee bent at an angle no knee was designed to hold. The metal pipe that had done it lay on the floor beside him. The two people responsible had already walked away, because certain debts, when they are finally settled, do not require anyone to linger over the wreckage. That moment was months away from where the story begins. And months before that, on the rooftop of a 33-floor building above a city that had no idea what was happening up there, a young man stood with blood pooling behind his eardrum and the world fracturing into tilted, unreliable pieces around him. His vision was gone in any practical sense. The vertigo was so severe that standing required most of his concentration. His opponent was faster and sharper and had spent years learning to read a fight before it happened. Park Han-joon swung anyway. His fist found exactly the right spot. But that ending belongs at the end. To understand it, you have to go back. Back to a gymnasium that no longer exists. Back to 2 years of silence. And back to the morning a 19-year-old billionaire walked into a convenience store and offered to change the terms of everything. Park Han-joon did not look dangerous. He was 17 and built the way people are built when their lives have required a lot of physical work from an early age. Broad across the shoulders, dense through the chest. But his face was calm and his voice, when he used it, was quiet. He wore the same jacket most days because it still fit him. He walked to school because the bus fare added up. His father had owned a boxing gym in their neighborhood for a long time. Not a prestigious one. A working gym. The kind where the bags smelled of sweat and old leather, and the floor tape had been replaced so many times the layers underneath had begun to show through. His father had built it piece by piece over many years, the way working men build things, trading other things off to afford each addition, buying used equipment and refurbishing it himself, staying late to keep the lights on. 2 years before the story started, Park had done something that cost his father that gym. A gang called Nexus controlled the delinquent hierarchy across several districts of Seoul and the Incheon region. They were not organized the way most street gangs are organized. They had chapters, rankings, enforced internal discipline, and most critically, they had corporate legal backing from the chaebol families who used Nexus as a tool in their own private conflicts. At the top of Nexus was a young man named Chan-soo Kim, composed, precise, and possessed of a quality in a fight that will matter later. He could read an opponent's next movement before it happened, tracking the small signals of breath and posture and eye shift that most people never learn to notice. Park had refused to join Nexus. He had gone further than refusing. He had stood against them. The confrontation itself lasted one night and was not reported to the police in any form close to the truth. What Nexus produced afterward was a carefully assembled counter-narrative. Witnesses, medical documents, a police report that matched the witness statements, and a law firm that specialized in civil settlements and knew exactly how to frame an assault case. The settlement demand arrived within months. It was not a number Park's family could absorb. His father sold the gym to pay it. Park had stood outside the gym the night before the paperwork closed and watched his father through the front window. His father was on the phone, calling people he had not spoken to in years, trying to scrape together a few more 100,000 won that would not be enough, but that he needed to try for anyway. The smile in his voice was a working smile, the kind a man puts on when his pride cannot afford to stop him from asking. Park had not gone inside. He had stood on the pavement until his father finished the calls and turned the lights off. Then he had made a decision that settled into his chest like wet concrete left to set. He would not fight again. Every time he used his fists, Nexus would produce a law firm. Every settlement would take something from his family that could not be returned. Chan-soo Kim had visited him in person to confirm the arrangement. He had made Park kneel in front of him. He had struck Park while Park's hands remained at his sides, and he had made Park say aloud, clearly, so there was no ambiguity, that he would never raise his fists again. Park had said it. Then Chan-soo had walked away. 2 years passed. At the school Park attended, the word moved through the student body within the first week. The new transfer was the kind who did not fight back. In that kind of school, that kind of reputation functions as an open invitation. Park took the shoves. He took the comments. He ate lunch at the end of a table where no one else sat and said nothing, because saying nothing cost nothing. He was calculating across a longer horizon than anyone around him understood. The morning everything shifted began with a mistake. A student named Mogul had organized the informal social structure of his classroom the way students like him always do, through the credible threat of violence and the careful collection of small debts and favors. He was large, habitually loud, and had spent the previous year ensuring that everyone in his immediate environment understood the arrangement. When the new transfer was assigned to his classroom, Mogul decided the efficient thing was to establish the arrangement early. He walked to Park's desk and made his position clear. Park stood up. He hit Mogul once. Mogul sat down on the floor and stayed there. The classroom went completely still. The students who had been watching, expecting the familiar result, expecting the new kid to fold, sat with their expressions frozen at the point where everything they had anticipated had broken apart. Park sat back down. He straightened the pencil on his desk. He looked at the board. The reason he had allowed himself to fight was sitting in the hallway outside the classroom, in a chair he had pulled from an empty room. Junwoo was 19 years old, dressed in plain clothes that concealed rather than announced his circumstances, reading something on a tablet with the relaxed patience of someone whose problems were no longer financial. He had arranged this visit 3 days earlier, and he had been waiting for Park to decide. Junwoo was not famous in any ordinary sense. He was known in specific financial circles because at 17 he had developed an algorithmic trading system that produced predictions about market movement with an accuracy that should have been impossible without insider access. The capital he had accumulated from that system had made most practical problems solvable, but he was not content, and money had not made him so, because what had produced his grief was not something wealth could undo. His friend had been named Hyak. They had grown up in the same building, gone to the same schools, and developed the kind of friendship that does not form from shared interests, but from proximity and time and the accumulation of small mutual understandings. Hyak had been brilliant and frustratingly undisciplined, and Junwoo had spent years trying to push him toward something that would hold him. Nexus had reached Hyak before Junwoo managed it. What Nexus left behind was a burned-out house in a neighborhood that had moved on, which Junwoo visited sometimes and which he could not bring himself to have demolished. He had spent a long time afterward mapping Nexus from the outside, their structure, their chapter hierarchy, the specific chaebol families at the top who funded their legal operations. He had found the precise weakness. Nexus's dominance was entirely dependent on their legal infrastructure. Their fighters operated freely because the financial consequence of fighting back was impossible for ordinary people to absorb. Remove that financial consequence, and Nexus was just a collection of people who hurt others for money. He had found Park Hanjun in a database of civil settlement records. When they met in the corner of a convenience store 2 blocks from Park's apartment, 2 days before the classroom, over paper cups of coffee that cost almost nothing, Junwoo laid it out plainly. Full legal coverage, effective immediately. Pre-authorized settlement payments. Any judgment resulting from any fight involving Park or his family would be absorbed before Park's father received so much as a notification. Park would use his fists. Nexus would fall. In exchange, Junwoo would direct Park's campaign to dismantle the syndicate all the way to its chaebol roots. Park had listened to all of it without interrupting. He had drunk his coffee. He had asked only whether the legal piece was real or conditional. Junwoo had pushed a document across the table. It was a pre-signed retainer agreement with one of the most aggressive litigation firms operating in the country, already naming Park Hanjun and his father as protected parties. The retainer was active as of that morning. Park had looked at it for a long time. He turned it over, read the second page, turned it back. Then he had nodded. The day after Mogul hit the floor, 3 things happened. First, Mogul, recovering in the bathroom with 2 of his associates, made phone calls. He contacted a regional crew leader named Jainong, who owed him a standing debt. Jainong's father had built a shipping operation through years of legitimate work and a quieter set of illegal contracts, and Jainong had inherited a portion of both. He ran 20-odd fighters, handled targeted operations for people who could pay, and had not yet encountered a situation he could not solve through weight of numbers. Second, the school administration summoned Park to the principal's office and informed him he was being expelled for assault. Third, Junwoo entered the principal's office 4 minutes after Park, sat across from the principal without being invited to sit, and placed a folder on the desk. The folder documented 17 separate incidents of delinquent violence on school grounds during the previous semester that the administration had failed to report to the police, as required under the relevant statute. Junwoo mentioned, without particular emphasis, that a media inquiry his firm had initiated that morning was pending, and that its resolution would depend substantially on the school's next decision. The principal did not expel Park. Mogul was expelled instead. The informal tribute structure he had maintained inside the school evaporated across a single afternoon. 3 students who had been paying stopped paying that day. 2 others visited the school counselor with complaints they had been holding for months. Mogul was eventually detained in connection with an earlier assault case that Junwoo's legal team resurfaced and moved to the front of the processing queue. The hearing that followed did not go favorably. He spent several weeks in juvenile detention before the judgment was finalized. Park watched all of this from his desk, eating a triangle of kimbap he had bought with exact change. He felt nothing particular about Mogul. The first stone had been moved from the path, and there were many more ahead. Jinong's crew found Park 4 days later, or believed they had found him, which is not quite the same thing. They used a warehouse 3 floors high off a side street, with ground-level lookouts stationed at the main approaches. Jinong had assembled 16 fighters and briefed them personally. Park was dangerous, in a direct confrontation, but manageable when approached collectively from multiple angles simultaneously. They settled in to wait. Park had done 2 passes of the building on different days, walking by at different times and looking at different things each time. He came back on the 4th day, not through the main approach, and not through any of the angles the ground floor lookouts were watching. He climbed the exterior on the building's blind side and entered through a 3rd-floor balcony window while the lead lookout was finishing a cigarette below. The next 14 minutes were the kind of thing that does not translate cleanly into summary. 16 fighters distributed across 3 floors meant Park never faced more than 4 at once, and 4 at once, even alert, even angry, was manageable. He moved methodically downward, floor to floor, and the men on each lower level heard sounds from above that did not make sense until the door opened. Jinong himself was the last. He was a capable fighter, fast, technically trained, not someone who relied solely on numbers to back him up, and he came at Park with real commitment. The exchange lasted longer than anything else that afternoon. Park took a shot along his ribs that stayed tender for nearly a week. Jinong moved with muscle memory rather than habit, which was harder to read. But reading was something Park could do, given enough data points. He absorbed what he needed to absorb, found the pattern underneath Jinong's combinations, and closed it. Jinong was carried out by 2 of his men who had recovered enough to walk. 2 days after that, Junwoo's people arranged a conversation with the creditors holding a significant portion of the refinancing debt on Jinong's father's shipping operation. Debt that Junwoo had quietly acquired a position in. The conversation made clear that continued access to favorable terms was contingent on the son withdrawing entirely from his current activities. Jinong's father agreed before the meeting was over. Jinong was relocated. He would be working on the family's sea farming operation at a location several hours from Seoul. The first layer had been cleared. Park had been thinking about Dongyan Kim for 2 years. Dongyan was his oldest real friend, the kind of friendship made not through choice but through proximity and shared stubbornness, the kind that calcifies into something durable when it is properly tested. They had grown up in the same neighborhood, trained at Park's father's gym together when they were young, and developed the easy shorthand of 2 people who have spent enough time together that full sentences are often redundant. 2 years earlier, a man named Moon-young Baek had hurt Dong-yan. Moon-young was a Nexus enforcer who worked with improvised efficiency. He used whatever was nearest when the situation called for it. During the ambush on Park's crew the night of the original confrontation, what was nearest had been a length of metal piping. Dong-yan's left knee had been crushed below the joint. The surgery that followed reconstructed the structural damage but could not restore what had been original. Dong-yan walked with a gait he had learned to minimize and trained every day at the school he now attended, a school with its own gang hierarchy and its own set of unspoken rules he navigated carefully. Park transferred there. The school's dominant group had heard about Mogul and about Jinong, though the version circulating had shed some accuracy in transit. Their leadership decided that a collective early confrontation would be more effective than waiting for the situation to develop. They were not wrong that waiting would make it worse. They were wrong about the solution. Park moved through the school's informal structure that first afternoon, with the systematic patience of someone who had already mapped the layout in his mind. There was no display to it, no performance. He was simply moving through a problem that had a finite number of parts, removing each one in the appropriate sequence. By early evening, the school's gang structure was flat and functionless. Dong Yan came to find him on the roof as the light faded. He had watched part of the afternoon from a window, standing with his hands around the ledge and his jaw tight, processing something that moved between pride and grief, and something he could not name precisely. He told Park that Gyeongchol, who had been part of what Park dismantled that day, was his to deal with. Park stepped back. He let Dong Yan handle it. The fight was not technically close in the way that fights on paper are close or distant. Dong Yan had the compromised knee and the shorter reach. Gyeongchol had spent 2 years training inside Nexus's system and was genuinely capable. By any measurement, Dong Yan should have lost before the halfway point. But Dong Yan had a quality that no measurement captured accurately. He could absorb punishment past the threshold where most people stop, not because he felt less, but because his stopping point was calibrated differently. He kept moving when Gyeongchol expected him to be done. When Gyeongchol's rhythm broke, because his expectations broke first, Dong Yan found the opening and used it completely. Gyeongchol did not leave on his own. Dong Yan sat on the rooftop ledge afterward with his bad knee extended, saying almost nothing. Park sat next to him. Below, the neighborhood made its ordinary sounds. Neither of them spoke directly about the 2 years that had passed. They did not need to. The silence between them was the kind that does not need to be filled. Junu's confirmation came 3 days later. The surgery was fully funded and scheduled at a clinic that specialized in sports reconstruction. The procedure lasted several hours and was successful. Dong Yan spent the recovery period with instructional Muay Thai materials spread across his bed and his laptop, studying footwork, low-kick mechanics, and clinch techniques with the focused hunger of someone who had been waiting a long time to use a knee that worked properly. The gambling network came next, and it required a different kind of dismantling. Taesu Choi ran 3 operations simultaneously, from addresses that changed on a monthly rotation. On the surface, they were entertainment businesses, 2 private card rooms, and a social club with a liquor license. Underneath, they were a loan shark system with a captive customer base. Men who had borrowed at terms they could not meet, who continued gambling because the gambling was the only mathematics that offered them a way out, and who remained loyal to Taesu's operation because their debt made loyalty non-optional. The numbers were substantial. Taesu's network moved significant cash through the card rooms, kept a stable of lawyers on retainer to handle any criminal exposure, and kept a standing enforcement roster, men who visited borrowers whose payments were late. He had been running this system for 4 years without meaningful disruption, because the police reports that occasionally arrived at the relevant precinct were rarely connected to anything that made them actionable. Junu had been building a picture of the operation's financial infrastructure for 6 weeks before he brought Park into the conversation. He spread the relevant documents across the low table in his apartment, printed, annotated in his small, precise handwriting, and walked Park through the structure the way someone explains a machine by pointing at the parts in sequence. Park listened, asked 2 questions, and understood the rest on his own. The vulnerability was the casino's internal broadcast system. Taesu ran a live video feed of the card rooms to a subscriber list. High-volume gamblers who placed remote bets, watched the rooms in real time, and received notifications when large pots were forming. The system was technically sophisticated and almost completely insecure from the inside, because the people who designed it were focused on outside intrusion and had not thought carefully about what happened if someone with physical access to the broadcast hardware decided to use it differently. Park walked into the main card room on a Tuesday afternoon through the service entrance, during the shift change when the security overlap was thinnest. He was not there to fight Taesu's enforcement team, though 3 of them tried anyway and were removed from the conversation with the flat efficiency of someone clearing a path rather than settling a score. What he was there to do was reach the broadcast hardware in the back office and hold the room. Junu's technical people had already prepared what they needed. When the afternoon session was midway through, the subscriber feed cut. When it returned, Junu was sitting in front of a plain wall with a folder of Taesu's financial records open beside him. He spoke for approximately 4 minutes. He covered the loan terms Taesu charged, specifically the gap between what was charged and the legal maximum, which constituted criminal usury under Korean financial law. He named the precinct captain who received quarterly payments to ensure certain reports were misfiled. He showed bank statements he should not have been able to access. Then he addressed Taisu's subscriber list directly. The 2 billion won bounty Taisu had placed on Park circulated through the gambling network 3 weeks prior as an incentive to his enforcement contacts, was, Junoo explained, now Taisu's own problem. He had arranged for the specific debt obligations of the 12 most heavily leveraged gamblers in the network to be acquired through a series of holding companies that morning. Those debts were now, effective immediately, uncollectible. The terms had been voided under the usury statute as part of a legal filing made that morning. Those 12 men still owed money. But they owed it to entities that would accept a different arrangement in lieu of cash. The live feed cut again. What followed was not organized. The men who had spent years fearing the knock on the door found the door going in the other direction, and the person they had feared most behind it suddenly occupied the same vulnerable geography they had been occupying. Taisu Choi was hospitalized 4 hours later. The attending physician's notes mentioned multiple contusions consistent with a physical altercation involving more than one party. The card rooms closed within the week. The social club with the liquor license had its license reviewed by an inspector who had received certain documentation by courier that morning. Park ate ramen at a stall near the transit station with Junoo that evening. Junoo paid. He always paid. Not as a demonstration of anything, but because the amounts involved were arithmetically irrelevant to him, and paying was simpler. Park ate his without comment. They talked about what came next. Incheon, specifically, and a chapter leader named Insu, who ran the tightest and most cohesive crew in the Nexus regional structure. The conversation about Insu was short. Junoo said that economic pressure alone would not work here. Insu's loyalty to his people was not financial and could not be dissolved with financial instruments. Park nodded. He already knew this, in the approximate way you know the shape of a room before you enter it. What he did not know was the shape of Insu's hands in a fight. Insu made the first move. This was his choice, deliberate and clearly considered. He could have waited for Park to come to Incheon on Park's terms, on Park's schedule, at a moment of Park's choosing. Instead, he arranged a hostage situation, methodical and brief, without unnecessary violence, because Insu was not the kind of person who used unnecessary anything. He picked up Junoo Oh on the street outside Junoo's building on a Thursday morning, had him transported to a facility in Incheon that his crew operated, and sent Park a message that contained an address and a time and nothing else. Park took the train. He arrived at the address and found Insu's crew arranged outside in a configuration that was not quite a welcome and not quite a threat. Something between the two that communicated only that this had been organized rather than improvised. Junoo was inside, unhurt, sitting at a table with a cup of tea that had been brought to him, because Insu's understanding of hospitality was apparently not suspended simply because the guest had not been invited. Insu came out himself to meet Park in the yard. He was compact and balanced in his stance. Not a man who carried himself like someone expecting a fight, but a man whose body had been shaped by enough of them that the readiness was structural rather than conscious. He had boxed competitively for 4 years before the debt situation that had pulled him into Nexus's orbit, and the discipline showed in the way he moved. Economical, minimal, nothing wasted. He told Park that Junoo would leave with Park at the end of the day, regardless of what happened between now and then. He was a chapter leader, not a kidnapper, and Junoo's presence was only to ensure Park showed up in person for a direct conversation. The conversation, he explained, was this. Incheon would not be dismantled by outside pressure, would not be dissolved by Junoo's financial maneuvering, and would not fold in the way Mogul and Jinong had folded. If Park wanted Incheon cleared from Nexus's roster, he would have to earn it here, against Insu, in a way that Insu's crew could accept. Park said he understood. He asked if there were conditions. Insu said one-on-one, until one of them quit or could not continue. Park nodded. They moved to the open ground behind the facility, and Insu's crew arranged themselves at the edges without being asked. The first 30 seconds established a problem Park did not have a clean solution to. Insu's boxing was not the decorative kind. It was applied, precise, built on footwork that controlled distance before any punch was thrown. He kept Park at a range where Park's natural strength advantage was neutralized, using lateral movement and half steps that reset his position faster than Park could close ground. The first combination landed cleanly and snapped Park's head back. The second found the same spot. Park walked into the next one intentionally. He let his chin absorb it rather than turning with it, and he read the shoulder rotation that had preceded it by approximately a quarter second, the tell that existed before the punch began its path. He took 3 more hits over the following minute and a half, absorbing information the way a student studies a text he knows he will need to reproduce later. Insu recognized what was happening before most people would have. He adjusted, varying his patterns, withdrawing from his 3 primary combinations to reach for less habitual movements. This was the right response. It was also, for Park, the signal that the first stage was complete, because Insu's adjustments told him what had been underneath the primary combinations, the instincts that the technical training had built on top of. The shift in the fight was not dramatic. There was no single moment where Park turned it around in a way the watching crew could point to. It was gradual and then definitive, Insu finding that his adjustments were being absorbed with the same patient efficiency as the original combinations, the margins compressing, the lateral movement no longer generating the clean distance it had generated before. When Insu shifted to something rawer, abandoning the technical framework for a berserker pressure that came from somewhere older than training, Park felt the change and moved with it rather than against it. Insu swinging from instinct rather than architecture was actually a problem Park could solve more directly. He pressed through it, took 2 shots to the body that would bruise deeply for a week, and found the geometric center of the exchange. It ended on the ground. Not with a knockout, with Insu's arm pinned at the outer limit of its articulation, held there by Park's body weight, with Insu choosing to stop rather than break it. A composed man to the end. He said clearly that he was done. Park released him immediately and helped him sit up. They were both breathing hard. Insu's crew was silent in the way that groups of people are silent when something has shifted that cannot be unshifted. Insu sat on the dirt with his forearms on his knees and looked at Park without hostility, the way a person looks at something they have properly measured and are now placing in the right category. He asked what came next. What came next was Junu sitting across from Insu inside the facility at the same table where Junu had drunk his tea, with a folder open between them and the financial records of Incheon's outstanding debt obligations laid out page by page. The crew's debt burden was substantial, accumulated through years of protecting a territory that cost more to protect each year as Nexus's demands increased. 3 of Insu's men were enrolled in night school or vocational programs, paying for it month to month from what they could set aside, which was not much. Junu cleared the debt in full. He also transferred a tuition prepayment for each of the 3 enrolled students directly to their institutions, covering the next 2 years. He set aside a small operating stipend for the transition period while the crew restructured towards something legal. Insu did not say much during this. He watched Junu go through the documents with the same measuring quality he had shown outside, evaluating what was being offered against the cost of it, and finding that it was genuine. When Junu finished, Insu folded the papers, squared them at the corners, and set them down. He said Incheon was Park's. What that meant was not symbolic. Over the following 12 days, Insu and his crew systematically withdrew their chapter from Nexus's operational structure, returning communications unanswered, removing themselves from the regional coordination network, and making it quietly clear to the adjacent chapters that Incheon was not available for the purposes it had previously served. The withdrawal was handled with enough structure that it did not appear to Nexus's central management as an active defection, only as a chapter going dark. At the chapter level, a message moved through the Nexus regional hierarchy. Something had happened in Incheon, and whatever it was, it had turned the tightest crew in the network. The message did not arrive at Chonsu Kim's level in clear terms, but enough fragments reached him that he noted it and set it aside to examine properly later. He did not yet know Park's name, which tells you something about how thoroughly Nexus had underestimated the campaign that had just completed its 3rd phase. The flashback, when Dongyan told it, came out in pieces over 2 evenings, not because it was difficult to tell, though it was difficult, but because Dongyan told things in the order he thought of them, rather than the order they happened, which meant some of the worst parts arrived before the context that explained them and had to be sat with until the explanation caught up. 2 years earlier, before the settlement, before the gym was sold, before Park's 2-year silence, there had been a real fight. Not the legal trap, A physical confrontation at scale, Nexus mobilizing across district lines to send a message to anyone who had been considering defiance. They had come with 100 men and a set of prepared constraints. Park and his crew were outnumbered and had been arranged into a position where numbers were the deciding variable. The men holding Park down used chains. Not a weapon chosen for efficiency but for humiliation, because Chansu wanted it to look specific and remembered. With Park immobilized, two of Nexus's people had held Dong Yan while Munyong Baek located a length of metal pipe and destroyed Dong Yan's knee. Munyong had done it methodically. One deliberate strike to the lateral structure of the joint, then a second to compound the damage and ensure the surgery that followed would be complicated. He had looked at Park while he did it. There had been a fire afterward. The circumstances were unclear in Dong Yan's account, as they had been in the official records. And in the chaos of the fire, Nexus's legal team had found the raw material for the civil suits. Witnesses who had seen what actually happened were either unreachable or had already been spoken to before they could be asked the right questions. Park listened to all of it without moving. He already knew most of it. He had been there for the parts he knew. What the 2 evenings gave him was something he had not had before. Dong Yan's experience of the night. From behind Dong Yan's eyes, which was different from Park's memory of it in the way that any single event looks different from different positions within it. Dong Yan had not asked Park to do anything in response. He was not telling it as a request. He was telling it because 2 years of partial silence had left the account compressed in a space it needed to be released from. When Dong Yan finished the second evening, he stretched his reconstructed knee experimentally, a habit he had developed during recovery, checking in with the joint, and said that the Muay Thai was going well. He was drilling low kicks against a heavy bag at the school's auxiliary gymnasium each morning. The timing still needed work, but the mechanics were sound. Park said that was good. They sat another 20 minutes before Park left. Munyong Baek came to them, which was the specific mistake that defined how it ended for him. He arranged it as a trap, or believed he had arranged a trap. The bait was a hostage, a contact of Junu's supply chain, seized and held at a building Munyong controlled, with a message delivered to Park's phone at 6 in the morning, specifying a location and a 6-hour window. If Park did not come, the contact situation would deteriorate. If Park came alone, Munyong had distributed his best fighters across a building with enough floors to run a gauntlet. The building had 8 floors. Munyong was on the roof. Park went in through the ground level and moved up. The fighters on each floor had been placed with some care, not clustered, but positioned to control the stairwells and restrict movement. On the second floor, there were 4. On the third and fourth, 2 each, with more on the upper levels. The composition varied. Some were technical. One on the 5th floor had a submission wrestling background that became clear within the first exchange, and the pair on the 6th had trained together long enough to move with the coordination that shared training produces. Park moved through them. It cost him. His left eye was partially closed by the 5th floor from a hit he had seen but not avoided quickly enough. The wrestling specialist had managed a takedown that Park had spent 40 seconds extracting himself from, which was 40 seconds he did not have in the building's timeline. He was bleeding from a split below his right ear when he reached the 7th floor and found no one there. Munyong had redistributed the floor's fighters elsewhere, which meant there were more on the roof than originally signaled. The contact was on the 6th floor, unharmed, secured to a chair with zip ties. Park freed her, told her to stay on that floor, and went up. The sounds from below happened before Park reached the roof access. He recognized what they were before he understood them specifically. Dong Yan and Insu had come independently, having reached the building through channels that Munyong's lookouts had not accounted for. Dong Yan had climbed the exterior by a route that used the building's service ladder, which Munyong's people had assumed no one with a compromised knee would attempt. Insu had come through a service entrance on the building's south face that the lookouts were covering from the wrong angle. The fighters on the lower floors who had recovered enough to regroup found Dong Yan and Insu before they found Park. The sounds were that conflict resolving. Park went through the roof access. Munyong was there with 2 men flanking him. When he saw Park's face, the eye, the cut, the clear evidence that the gauntlet had worked in some measure even if it had not stopped him, he had the expression of a man recalculating. He had expected Park to come up exhausted and constrained. He had not expected Park to come up still moving with the particular quality that very hard people move with, which is that the damage they carry does not alter their fundamental orientation. Munyong came forward. He was a dirty fighter in the specific sense that he was committed to it. He used everything available without preference between what was legitimate and what was not. He went for the damaged eye early, with fingers rather than a fist, and his second movement produced a folding knife from his jacket's inner pocket. Park took the eye strike on his forearm rather than his face, and controlled the knife hand at the wrist, applying pressure in the direction that the wrist did not want to go. The knife left Munyong's grip before Munyong made a deliberate decision to release it. The two flanking men lasted briefly. One connected with a kick that found Park's ribs on the side already tender from the Jinong fight, old damage meeting new pressure, and Park's vision grayed slightly at the edges before it cleared. He put them down in the order that made structural sense. Munyong, alone now, fought on. He was tough in the way that people who have always used toughness as their primary instrument are tough, with the stubbornness of someone who has never developed a backup strategy. He took damage and kept coming, and took more damage and adjusted nothing. Park eventually had him down. Dong Yan came through the roof access while this was happening and stood at the top of the stairs. He looked at Munyong on the ground and was still for a moment. The metal pipe Munyong had used on Dong Yan's knee 2 years earlier was not there. Munyong did not carry one as a habit, only as an improvisation when the situation offered it. There was a length of rebar near the building's edge, left over from incomplete construction work on the parapet. Dong Yan walked to it. He picked it up. He stood over Munyong and held it for a long beat. Then he set it down. He told Munyong he was not doing it the way Munyong had done it. He was not going to be that, regardless of what Munyong had cost him. He stepped back. Park picked up the rebar. He hit Munyong's knee once, with a focused and directed force. The medical term for what followed would describe damage to the lateral collateral ligament and the fibula head. The practical result was that Munyong Baek would be measured for a wheelchair before the month ended, and would be fitted for one before the year was out. The hospital record would list it as an injury sustained during a fall. Nobody contested that record. Dong Yan and Park stood on the rooftop as the evening light came flat across the city. Below, Insu and his people were wrapping things up in the way that unsentimental, capable people wrap things up. Neither Park nor Dong Yan mentioned what had happened with the rebar decision. They did not need to. Each of them understood what the other had done, and what it had cost to do it, and that some debts are paid in ways you do not talk about afterward. They went down. The chaebol world had its own delinquency, better dressed and harder to reach. The Seongan Group was a conglomerate of the kind that had accumulated itself across 3 generations of strategic marriages, political connections, and the selective memory that old Korean money applies to its origins. It operated across shipping, construction, media, and a financial services arm that managed other people's capital in ways that consistently produced returns their investors found unremarkable and their rivals found suspicious. The 3rd generation had consolidated the group's reputation. The 4th generation was in the process of destroying it from the inside. There were 4 heirs in direct competition. Dong Ho Lee had the most institutional support, the traditional path, the right schools, the right committee memberships, the signature on the right documents. He had also been using Nexus as a private instrument for 3 years, routing resources to Chansu Kim's organization in exchange for services that could not appear in any official ledger. Lion Kim was the alternative candidate, sharper, more ruthless, less interested in the appearance of legitimacy. He played a longer game and kept his alliances more current. Siang Alim held a smaller position, female and therefore underestimated, which she used with the efficiency of someone who has had long practice turning that specific mistake against the people who make it. And then there was Geo, the youngest, the most impulsive, the one who had decided that financial destruction was cleaner than physical conflict and had built a strategy around it. Geo had identified Junu O's operation 6 weeks after Taisu Choi was hospitalized. He had found the trail through the debt instruments Junu had used to acquire the gambling network's obligations, traced those to the holding companies, traced the holding companies to their ultimate beneficial owner, and arrived at the profile of a 19-year-old whose only vulnerability was financial in nature. Geo's theory was simple. Junu was a single individual, not an institution, and a single individual, however wealthy, could be cornered if the right pressure was applied to the right instruments at the right moment. He moved against 3 of Junu's core positions simultaneously in a coordinated shorting action involving entities Geo controlled through 3 separate jurisdictions. The attack was sophisticated, genuinely so. Geo had good instincts and better advisors, and the execution was timed to coincide with a regulatory announcement that created a window of volatility during which the shorts would compound. Under ordinary circumstances, a position of Junu's size would have absorbed significant losses before stabilizing. Junu was not, it turned out, a single individual in the way Geo had modeled him. He had a relationship with Siang Alim that predated the Nexus campaign by more than a year, a professional arrangement born from a period when Siang had needed algorithmic forecasting on a specific market movement, and Junu had provided it with an accuracy that left her with a debt she took seriously. When Geo's coordinated action arrived, Siang's fund countered it with a position in the opposite direction before the morning session closed. The short was caught between two sources of buying pressure and began to collapse against itself. Geo reversed within 4 hours. The loss was not catastrophic, but it was large enough to require explanation, and the explanation, once it began to unfurl through the institutional channels where these things travel, revealed the mechanism clearly enough that it became a story, the kind of story that circulates at the level where inheritance decisions are made. Siang sent Geo a message 2 days later. It was brief. It told him that the documentation of his coordination of the three entities, which was technically a violation of market manipulation statutes in 2 of the 3 jurisdictions, was held by a legal firm she trusted. The documentation's disposition would remain undetermined for as long as Geo's conduct in the immediate future gave no reason to determine it. Geo read the message 3 times. He was not stupid. The proof of that was how close the financial attack had come to working. He understood what was being communicated and what it meant for the specific moves available to him in the near term. He arranged a proxy fight instead. The stadium was a second-tier athletic facility in a district outside the main city, used primarily for regional track and field events and the occasional private hire. Geo booked it under a corporate entity for a weekend and spent 3 weeks assembling the fighters he would send. They were not gangsters. That was the specific innovation that gave the arrangement its shape. Geo recruited from athletic programs, 3 university-level wrestlers, a kickboxer who had placed at national level the previous year, 2 long-distance runners who had been approached to supplement the physical work rather than the fighting, and a baseball pitcher from a collegiate program who had an ERA that the sports press found interesting. The pitcher's relevance became clear later. The logic was that against trained athletic specialists, the street fighting orientation of Park's crew would be structurally disadvantaged. Wrestlers knew control. A competitive kickboxer knew real distance management, not the improvised version. The athletes had training regimens, conditioning programs, and institutional support that Nexus's chapter fighters had matched only through volume of experience. Park was not at the stadium when it started. This was not an oversight. He was at his father's gym, a rented space 2 train stops from their apartment, smaller than the original, with exposed concrete walls and a heavy bag that his father had owned for so long it had developed a particular sound during impact, a softened thud that suggested the fill had compressed unevenly over the years. His father had been using it to train local youth for the previous 18 months, and it smelled the way his father's original gym had smelled, which was something Park noticed without comment each time he visited. The penetrating strike was not a technique in any formal sense. It did not appear in a syllabus or a curriculum. Park's father had discovered it through the specific process of making the same mistake very many times in a row, and then adjusting, a method that produces knowledge of the kind that cannot be transferred easily through instruction, only through demonstration and approximation. The principle was focal compression. Instead of releasing force at the point of impact, which transfers energy into the target and produces surface damage, the force is directed through the impact point and held in compression for the fraction of a second before it disperses. The structural effect is an internal shock rather than an external one. The visible result, when applied correctly, is that the target experiences the impact not as pressure on the surface but as a wave that originates from somewhere inside. Park's father demonstrated on the concrete wall of the gym with 1 strike, leaving an impression in the surface that no gym wall should record from a bare fist. He was not a large man and was no longer young, and watching him produce that result from those circumstances was one of the more informative things Park had ever seen. They worked the mechanics for most of the day. Park's father was not a patient teacher in the methodical sense. He corrected by demonstration rather than explanation, and his corrections were small and specific and sometimes needed multiple passes before their purpose became clear. But by the fourth hour, Park's father had stopped correcting and was only watching, which was its own kind of communication. Park's phone showed 9 missed calls before he left the gym. Dong Yan had been there from the start. He had brought Jong Yoon, which required a brief explanation of who Jong Yoon was. Jong Yoon had appeared in Dong Yan's orbit 3 weeks earlier, through the particular gravitational pull that competent, useful people sometimes exert on each other. He was lean and fast, and motivated almost entirely by his devotion to Seo Yan Choi, the influencer, who had by this point transitioned from reconnaissance asset to something more integrated within Junu's support operation. Jong Yun's regard for Choi was of the specifically uncalibrated kind that made him fight through situations where most rational people would have taken inventory of the available exits. Choi tolerated this with the patient amusement of someone who found it both absurd and occasionally convenient. At the stadium, Jong Yun's primary function was supposed to be perimeter support. This plan was adjusted by circumstances almost immediately. Dong Yun had assessed the athletic recruits from the moment they entered the facility. He understood from their warm-up routines what their backgrounds were. The wrestlers moved with the hip-heavy patterning of people who have spent years at floor level. The kickboxer stretched with the particular ankle flexion sequence that competitive Muay Thai fighters use, and the collegiate athletes had the clean cardiovascular readiness of people who maintained it as a professional obligation rather than a preference. He took the kickboxer himself. This was a decision rather than an assignment. Dong Yan had been waiting for a specific kind of opponent since the surgery, one whose primary weapons were the same as his own, where the comparison would tell him something real about where he had arrived. The kickboxer was genuinely good. His distance work was sound and his timing on the low kick was authentic rather than decorative. But Dong Yan had been drilling low kicks against a heavy bag for months, with the concentration of a man who has nothing else in that time slot. He had studied footage of every decent low kick fighter he could find, noting the weight distribution shifts that preceded each variation. Against the kickboxer, he absorbed the first 2 genuine strikes, measured them, and identified the shift. The third time the kickboxer loaded the kick, Dong Yan checked it with his shin rather than absorbing it on the thigh, and checked it on the precise angle that converts the force against the kicker's own structure. The kickboxer adjusted. Dong Yan adjusted after him. The exchange developed across 7 minutes, which is long enough for a fight to develop into something that teaches both parties things they did not know about themselves beforehand. Dong Yan won it. Not cleanly. He was down once, recovered, and won it. He rolled his ankle on the recovery and fought the rest of the bout with it, which became evident later when the adrenaline reduced and he was standing at the edge of the facility needing to hold the wall. Jong Yoon had managed 2 of the wrestlers, which required substantially more improvisation than his original function had called for. Wrestling, when applied by someone competent, is nearly impossible to address without either matching wrestling or creating distance that wrestling cannot close. Jong Yoon had spent most of his athletic history in environments where the answer to wrestling was to not be grabbed in the first place. He was fast enough to manage the first, moderately successfully. The second caught him anyway and took him down. What Jong Yoon lacked in technical answer to the ground, he partially compensated for in stubbornness and a particular quality of optimism that did not decrease when the situation argued against it. He worked out of 2 bad positions through friction and persistence rather than technique, which impressed the watching Dong Yan enough to be mentioned later. 3 of Gio's fighters remained when Park arrived through the stadium's side entrance. He had come directly from his father's gym without changing. He still had chalk residue on his right hand from the concrete wall exercise. The situation as presented to him was Dong Yan against a wall favoring one leg, Jong Yoon with a split above his cheekbone, and one eye reading the room carefully for threats, 2 wrestlers who had recovered enough to be operational, the college pitcher standing near the south end of the facility with a pitching machine, the portable kind used for practice sessions, plugged into a generator he had apparently located and connected himself, and Gio, standing at the north end in a suit that cost more than Park's father's monthly rent. Gio activated the pitching machine. The machine was rated at 300 kilometers per hour, and the pitcher knew how to load it. The first ball left before Park had fully cleared the entrance. Park moved laterally, reading the machine's barrel angle the way he read any directional signal, by where it was pointing before the event rather than reacting after. The ball struck the concrete wall behind where he had been standing and left a divot that would remain there when the facility management conducted their post-hire inspection 3 days later. The second and third balls came faster. The pitcher adjusted the trajectory each time, watching where Park moved and compensating forward. Park was faster than the adjustment. He closed the distance between himself and the machine at an angle the pitcher had not modeled, not directly toward it, which would have presented the obvious target, but diagonally, using the concrete support pillars as brief obstructions. He reached the pitcher before the fourth ball could be loaded. The conversation with the pitcher was brief and physical, and ended with the pitcher seated on the ground beside his machine, which had been tipped onto its side. The two recovered wrestlers came together. Park had just spent a full day learning to focus energy through a specific point, and the application was different against a person than against a concrete wall, but the underlying mechanic was present in a different form, controlling where the force arrived and what it did when it got there. He put one wrestler down with a single exchange, absorbed a legitimate double-leg takedown from the second that took him to the mat, and worked back up through the grip in a way that used the floor as leverage rather than fighting the motion. Gio had been walking toward the exit since Park cleared the pitcher. Park was faster walking than Gio moving urgently, which is one of those asymmetries that defines what happens next without requiring elaboration. He stepped in front of Gio and stood there. Gio stopped. He looked at Park's face, the chalk, the existing damage from the day's work at the gym, the particular calm of someone who is not angry, only present, and made a social calculation that his experience had not previously required him to make. Park told him to go home. Gio went home. The financial arrangements that followed were handled by Junu's team over the subsequent week. Gio's exposure from the market manipulation documentation remained in Siang's keeping. The arrangement was restated in more explicit terms. Gio's participation in the succession contest would henceforth proceed through legitimate channels exclusively, which reduced his competitive viability significantly, which was the point. Chansu Kim had been watching. Not the stadium, he did not have a physical presence there. But the Nexus regional structure had enough nodes that information about significant events moved through it quickly, and what had moved through in the previous months amounted to a detailed account of systematic demolition. Mogul, gone. Jinong, removed and relocated. Taisu, hospitalized and his network dissolved. Incheon, dark and non-responsive. Munyong Baek, in a wheelchair at a rehabilitation facility outside the city. Chansu had built Nexus from an informal arrangement between a few district-level crews into a structured organization with chapter governance, clear hierarchy, and reliable legal backing. He had done this over 4 years through patience, intelligence, and a quality of controlled aggression that expressed itself as policy rather than impulse. Every decision he had made about the organization's shape was defensible in retrospect. He did not waste resources on revenge. He did not make moves he could not support structurally. He looked at what had happened to his organization's outer layers and understood that a direct response through those same layers would produce the same result. The system that had worked was not going to work against this specific opponent. He went to his former comrades, the original core who had been with him at the beginning, before Nexus had chapters and legal backing and chaebol affiliations. He sat with them individually over 3 evenings and had honest conversations about what had been built and what it had cost, and what they were being asked to do with their lives on behalf of people whose surnames they could not use in public. He was persuasive in the way that people who believe what they are saying are persuasive, which is the most effective kind. He asked them to start again, smaller, internally loyal, independent of outside financial backing. They agreed, one by one, with the particular gravity of people who are agreeing to something whose consequences they understand clearly. Then he called Dong Ho Lee and told him he was no longer available. This was a betrayal in the narrow sense. Nexus had operated under Dong Ho's financial patronage for 3 years, and withdrawing that resource at this specific moment, when Dong Ho's position in the succession contest was already weakening, was more damaging than a straightforward withdrawal would have been in quieter times. Dong Ho received the call, understood its full implications within the length of the conversation, and said nothing for a long moment after Chansu finished. Then he ended the call and began trying to rebuild his position through other means, which would not succeed before the relevant window closed. Chansu called Lion Kim the following morning. Lion had been waiting for this call in the way that patient people wait for things they have correctly predicted. Without showing the prediction, without creating pressure, without appearing to have arranged anything. He received Chansu's proposal as though the idea had occurred to them both simultaneously and asked only 2 questions: timeline and terms. Chansu's answers satisfied both. The new nexus, under Lion's backing, was leaner and more specific. It did not need regional chapters or a network of loosely affiliated enforcers. It needed 3 things: Chansu himself, Moon, the elite martial artist who headed the original combat division and who had followed Chansu through the restructuring, and a clear objective. The objective, which Lion made explicit in a second meeting held in a private room of a restaurant that does not appear on any public reservation system, was Park Hanjun and the elimination of Junu O's operation. Lion proposed the mechanism, a formal negotiated contest, binding in the terms that people in this world bind agreements, not through courts, but through the logic of face and witness and consequence. Junu would be approached with an all-or-nothing arrangement. 3 representatives from each side. A building. The first team to reach the top floor claimed victory and the right to dissolve what the losing side had built. The building Lion specified was OJ Group headquarters, 33 floors, Junu's own territory, which was itself a signal about whose terms these were. Junu received the proposal through a formal intermediary and read it twice at his desk in the apartment that contained almost no furniture because he had never prioritized it. On the second read, he called Seong, who listened, asked 3 clarifying questions about the binding terms, and offered her assessment in a single sentence. Then Junu sat for a while with the document in his hands. He had a photograph on the shelf behind his desk, the only decorative object in the apartment, of himself and Hayak at a significant age, standing outside the building where they had grown up. Hayak was making an expression that was somehow both ridiculous and completely genuine, which had been the quality that made him impossible to stay angry at. Junu looked at the photograph, which he did this sometimes without looking like he was doing it. He called Park. Park came to the apartment that evening, sat in one of the 2 chairs Junu owned, and listened to the terms. He asked which building, and when Junu told him, he was quiet for a moment, absorbing the specific detail that the location meant, the statement it was intended to make. He said he would need Dongyan and Insu. He said Jongyun could run secondary. Junu said he had already assumed that. They worked out the structure across the following hour. 3 representatives ascending the building against Chansu's team and Moon and whoever else Lion had secured. The stairwells, elevators, and access points would each need to be managed for the team to move effectively rather than getting separated and addressed individually. The advantage they had was cohesion. Park's group had fought alongside each other enough to move with shared understanding rather than coordination that required communication. The disadvantage was Chansu Kim. Park had not yet been in the same room as Chansu. What he knew about Chansu's combat ability came from the account of the original confrontation 2 years ago. Specifically, the way Chansu had moved before each strike, the predictive quality that the people who had fought him described with a consistency that suggested it was real rather than mythological. A fighter who reads breathing patterns and eye movement and the micro shifts of weight distribution that precede every deliberate movement is a different problem from a fighter who simply hits hard or moves fast. Park thought about his father's gym, the chalk on the wall, the sound the bag made when the strike landed with the focal compression in it instead of without. He did not say what he was thinking. He went home. He went back to the gym the next morning and worked the mechanic for another 4 hours, until his father stopped correcting and stood watching again, and until the concrete wall had a second impression beside the first. The morning of the OJ Group Tower had a quality of ordinary overcast that Seoul produces reliably in that season. Flat light, the kind that makes distances hard to judge, and colors look 1 shade closer to gray than they actually are. The building itself was 40 meters back from the main street, separated by a vehicle court that the corporation used for executive arrivals. At 7 in the morning, the court was empty. By 7:30, it would not be. Park arrived first. He stood at the edge of the court and looked at the building the way he had looked at Jinong's warehouse from across the street. Assessing, noting, filing. 33 floors of glass and steel, and the specific corporate confidence of a building designed to communicate that the people inside it made consequential decisions. The lobby level was visible through the glass facade. A reception desk, a security station, two banks of elevators arranged left and right of a central atrium, and a stairwell access door on the building's east side that had been included in the architectural drawings Junu's team had obtained 3 days prior. Insu arrived 4 minutes later with two of his people, not to fight but to hold communications between floors and manage extraction if something went badly. He assessed the building without looking like he was assessing it and stood next to Park without speaking. Dongyan came with Jongyun. Dongyan's ankle from the stadium had fully recovered. He moved without favoring it, which Park had noticed and not mentioned, because mentioning it would have been redundant. Jongyun had a split lip from the stadium that had healed into a faint line and was wearing an expression of focused anticipation he probably could not have removed if he tried. Junu was not there. This was agreed. Junu was the strategic asset, not the physical one, and his value in the tower was 0 and his risk was everything. He was in a car 3 blocks away with Xiang's legal contact and access to a direct line to each of them. Park looked at the group. He said the structure once, clearly, and did not repeat it. Dongyan would take the east stairwell and hold the lower 12 floors. Insu would take the central elevator bank and control access from 8 through 16. Jongyun would work between them and fill gaps. Park would go up the west stairwell and keep moving until the roof. They went in. Lion Kim's team was already inside. This had been anticipated. The building had been vacated by OJ Group management under a corporate emergency protocol that Junu had activated through the holding company Xiang's fund had quietly acquired a minority position in 2 months earlier. A procedural lever that cleared the floors without requiring a visible instruction from anyone. What it did not clear was Lion's access, because Lion had simply arrived before the protocol activated, which was either anticipation or information, and both possibilities said the same thing about the level of preparation they were facing. Moon was on the 14th floor. Dongyan found this out the way you find things out inside a building that has gone quiet, by the sound of something that should not be there, moving 1 floor above him. He had cleared floors 2 through 11 with Jongyun working the adjacent landings, and the quality of the resistance there had been real but manageable. Fighters who were capable and committed, but not the kind of capable that required Dongyan to recalibrate in the middle of an exchange. By the 11th floor he had a clear picture of what his body had available for the remainder, and he was being conservative about spending it. The 14th floor was different. Moon descended to meet him at the landing between 13 and 14. He had the build of someone whose training had never been recreational, not built outward for display but inward for function, with the economy of movement that comes from having spent years being corrected when you waste energy. His motivation, as Junu had described it from intelligence gathered during the restructuring period, was not money or loyalty in any ordinary sense. He had come up alongside fighters who were naturally gifted in ways he was not, and had watched them coast on talent while he built each capability through effort and repetition, and had developed from that experience an inferiority complex that had long since calcified into something harder and more specific. A need to prove, repeatedly and conclusively, that preparation outperforms gift. He was technically the best fighter in Nexus's restructured core. This was a fact, not a characterization. Dongyan did not try to match him on technical terms. He had understood from the first minute of the exchange that meeting Moon's technique with technique would be a losing equation, that Moon had too many hours in too many systems, had covered angles that Dongyan's Muay Thai training had not yet reached. What Dongyan had was the quality he had always had, the calibration that sits the stopping point further back than most people's, the willingness to be in a bad position and continue working from it, and the specific knowledge that what he needed was not to defeat Moon, but to delay him. He bought time in increments. Jongyun arrived on the landing at the 15-minute mark, having cleared the east side's upper approach. His contribution to the Moon problem was disruptive rather than decisive. He was fast enough to create angles that split Moon's attention, and splitting Moon's attention gave Dongyan the partial second his timing needed. It was not elegant. Several of the exchanges had the quality of two people hanging onto something rather than climbing it, but they were still there at the 20-minute mark, and Moon was spending time on the 14th floor that he had intended to spend somewhere else. Insu was holding the elevator bank. The 3 men Lion had positioned at the central bank were not Nexus fighters, they were private security, the kind retained by high-value corporate clients, with the professional detachment of people who treat physical conflict as task management. They were competent, and they had the numerical advantage, and they worked in coordinated pairs, the way trained security works, covering each other's angles without requiring communication. Insu had grown up in Incheon, managing situations where the numbers were not in his favor. He had not found this comfortable. It was never comfortable, but he had found it workable, given enough time. He moved through the security team with a controlled ferocity that was different from what he had shown Park on the day they fought. That day he had been fighting with something to prove, with his crew watching, with the weight of Incheon's identity on his shoulders. Today there was none of that. He was simply doing a job he had agreed to do, among people he trusted, and the doing of it had the clean efficiency of unambiguous purpose. He held the elevator bank. Park went up. The west stairwell was quiet in the way that prepared ambush sites are quiet. Not empty, but managed. Lion's people were positioned at intervals, with enough space between each cluster that a fighter who was being methodical about it would need to address each one separately. Park was methodical. He moved upward steadily, and the floors went by in the counting rhythm of someone who has given himself an internal metric by which to measure progress. On the 19th floor, 2 men came through the stairwell access door into the landing as he reached it, which meant they had been monitoring his progress from above and timed the interception rather than waiting passively. This was a smarter arrangement than what he had found on the lower floors. He managed the timing problem by changing his own timing, stopping 1 floor below rather than arriving at the landing when expected, which created a gap in their synchronization that he used to enter from below rather than from within. On the 23rd floor, he was alone. The floor above had been cleared and the floor below confirmed. He stood on the landing for 30 seconds with his back against the concrete wall, running a quiet inventory of what was available and what was spent. His ribs from the stadium had not been given sufficient time to fully resolve. His right hand, from the second day of work on his father's gym wall, had a bruise across the second and third knuckle that registered during full-force impact. Everything else was functional. He went up. 24, 27, 30. The resistance thinned on the upper floors in the way that resistance thins when it has been concentrated at specific points rather than distributed evenly, and the specific points had been chosen for the lower structure rather than the summit. Whoever had planned Lion's arrangement had expected Park's team to be stopped before they reached the 20s. By the 32nd floor, the stairwell was genuinely empty. Park stood at the access door to the rooftop and put his hand against it and felt whether there was anything on the other side that would tell him something before he opened it. There was nothing. He opened it and went through. The roof of the OJ Group Tower was a flat expanse of sealed concrete, with HVAC units positioned along the west edge and a communications array at the northeast corner. The wind at that height was cold and consistent. The city spread in every direction below the parapet. Not beautiful exactly, but vast. The way things are vast when you are above them, and they extend past the point where you can see them end. Chansu Kim was standing near the communications array. He had come up ahead of time, which was his nature, arriving before the conditions required him to, not from anxiety, but from the understanding that familiarity with ground is a resource. He had been on the roof for 12 minutes. He knew where the sun sat relative to each angle of approach, where the wind created interference with peripheral hearing, where the HVAC units would block lateral movement if someone was not managing their position carefully. He looked at Park and said nothing. Park said nothing back. There was a quality in the space between them that had the particular weight of 2 years' worth of deferred accounting. Chansu came forward first. What the people who had described his fighting ability had communicated accurately was the prediction, the reading of intention before it became movement. What they had communicated less clearly was its texture. It did not feel, from Park's first 30 seconds on the roof, like facing someone who was reacting faster than ordinary. It felt like facing someone who was already at the destination before Park had decided to go there. A slight adjustment before each strike that seemed less like defense and more like positioning for the consequence. An angle that was always marginally better than it should have been. Park had expected this. He had thought about it for weeks without finding a clean solution. The technique worked by reading signals, breath, weight transfer, the eye's unconscious preview of where a punch would go. Remove the signals, and the technique had no input to read. A person who has no breath pattern cannot be predicted by breath pattern. A person who moves from habit rather than intention cannot be anticipated through intention reading. What Park could do was take hits and learn from them. This was not new information to him. It was the foundation of how he had fought Insu, how he had addressed the kickboxer's adjustments at the stadium, how he had solved every fighter whose system was initially opaque to him. But Chansu was significantly more sophisticated than those opponents, and the cost of the learning phase would be higher. He paid it. The first 3 minutes of the fight were the most damaging he had experienced since the night 2 years ago when he was held in chains. Chansu was precise in a way that made each hit land on a specific target rather than landing wherever contact happened to occur: the rib that was already compromised, the eye that had been partially closed in the Munyong gauntlet, the side of the neck where a clean hit would degrade coordination. Park ate them. He stayed moving. He let his body absorb information and file it. The inner ear strike came on the 7th minute. Chansu had identified, through the reading that was his primary instrument, the particular quality of defensive attention Park was giving to his right side versus his left, and had found a window on the left that Park's loading pattern did not cover consistently. The heel palm strike to the left ear was not the hardest thing that landed during the fight. It did not need to be. The ear's architecture converted force into physiological disruption regardless of magnitude, and the disruption was immediate and comprehensive. The world tilted. Park's visual field became unreliable within 2 seconds of the impact. Not dark, but spatially incorrect, the horizon disagreeing with his inner ear about its own location. His stance shifted involuntarily as his balance system worked with contradictory data. Chansu pressed forward, reading the disruption accurately, and landed 2 clean follow-up strikes to positions that a stable opponent would have protected without difficulty. Park moved toward the communications array. He was using the bulk of it as a spatial anchor, something fixed and physical that he could orient to, not because it would protect him, but because without a fixed reference, the vertigo made the roof feel like a tilting surface that did not predictably remain where he had last felt it. He closed his eyes. This was not surrender. It was the removal of the unreliable input. With his eyes open, his visual cortex was receiving information that contradicted his proprioception and making both worse. With his eyes closed, there was only proprioception and spatial memory. Spatial memory was what he had. 12 minutes of familiarity with this specific roof, the position of the HVAC units, the distance from the communications array to the east parapet, the width of the path between the array and the main access structure. Chansu came forward. He came forward the way he always came forward, reading the signals. Park was not producing signals. His eyes were closed. His breathing was not conscious enough to be patterned. It was the breathing of someone managing vertigo, shallow and irregular. His weight was not transferring in the preliminary way that precedes a committed movement, because he was not making committed movements. He was standing near a fixed object with his eyes shut, which was the one configuration for which Chansu's predictive framework had no established input. Chansu struck anyway, committing to an angle derived from what the posture suggested. Park felt the air of the incoming movement through the disruption, not seeing, not predicting, but receiving the displacement that a fast-moving arm produces in the cold rooftop air at close distance, the way you feel a door open in a dark room from across it. He moved inside the angle. He planted his right foot. He compressed through his hip and shoulder in the sequence his father had corrected across 2 full days of work, and he focused everything that compression could carry, not into the surface he was about to reach, but through it. The strike landed on Chansu's chest, below the collarbone and above the heart. The sound was not loud. The effect was not distributed across the surface but arrived somewhere interior, as though the impact had found the center of something and addressed it directly. Chansu stopped moving. He was still standing. The strike had not knocked him down in the conventional sense of knocking someone down. What it had done was arrive somewhere that the body, when it receives a signal from there, treats as a systemic instruction. His legs lost their reliable communication with the rest of him for 1 full second. In that second, Park struck twice more, not with the focal compression, which had spent what was available in the first hit, but with the accumulated force of someone whose hands still worked and who needed 2 more definitive contacts to confirm the situation conclusively. Chansu went down on the second strike. He was conscious. He lay on the cold concrete of the roof with his chest working slowly, processing what had happened, with the same intelligence that had organized Nexus and restructured it, and predicted Park's every movement for 7 minutes. Park stood over him and waited. After a long moment, Chansu brought one hand up and placed it flat on the concrete beside him, and pushed himself to a sitting position. He sat with his back against the communications array, where Park had been standing moments before. He looked at his own hands briefly, then at Park. He said he understood. Park nodded. He sat down on the concrete a meter away, because his balance still required something close to the ground, and because there was nothing left that required either of them to stand. Lion Kim received the notification from his floor monitor at the building's midpoint. Rooftop had been reached. He was in the vehicle court below, in the back of a car with tinted windows, and he had been watching the building's face for the past 40 minutes with the particular stillness of someone who has already run the calculation and is waiting for the arithmetic to produce its result. He made 3 calls. The first was to Moon, instructing him to stop where he was. The second was to the security team at the elevator bank. The third was to his lawyer. Then he got out of the car and walked to the building's main entrance and took the elevator to the lobby level and waited there until Junu arrived. The conversation between them lasted 11 minutes. Junu's legal contact was present and recording. Lion spoke quietly and completely. Without performing composure he did not feel, which was the most impressive thing about him, that even at the conclusion of a contest he had lost, his manner did not collapse into anything smaller than what it had been at the start. He confirmed, in terms that satisfied the legal contact, that Nexus as a structure would cease operations. The connections to the Siangan Group's non-legitimate activities, from Lion's division specifically, would be unwound over a period not to exceed 60 days, with documentation provided to Junu's team at each stage of the unwinding. The legal framework supporting the syndicate's operational immunity was withdrawn effective that morning. Junu listened to all of it without visible reaction. When Lion finished, Junu thanked him with the brevity of someone for whom courtesy is habit rather than performance. Lion left. His car was in the vehicle court, and his driver had the door open when he reached it. He got in. The car moved into traffic and joined the ordinary flow of the morning city, and became indistinguishable from everything else moving through it. The resolution arrived in stages, the way things actually resolve when they are real rather than fictional. Not in a single clear moment, but in the accumulation of smaller confirmations over weeks. Dong Ho Lee's succession candidacy was effectively finished by the withdrawal of Nexus's operational support, at the precise moment when the Sanggon Group's internal power audit was already disadvantaging him. He remained a figure within the group's governance, but at a reduced capacity that he would spend the next several years trying to reverse, and mostly failing to. The audit, when it concluded, produced a restructured board composition that Siang Alim's positioning had quietly anticipated. Moon Baek was discharged from his rehabilitation facility into a modified living arrangement that would accommodate the chair. The medical team's assessment of his long-term prognosis noted strong upper body function and intact cognitive capacity. No criminal complaint had been filed in connection with his injury. The hospital record stood undisturbed. Taisu Choi's operations did not reopen. The legal filing that had voided the usury structured debts remained on the public record. 2 of the 3 cardroom locations became a karaoke venue and a logistics office, respectively. The third remained vacant for over a year. Gyeongchol left the city. No one in Dongyan's orbit asked after him or mentioned his name with particular frequency. Junu had kept Hayak's burned house standing for 2 years because demolishing it felt like completing something he was not prepared to complete. He had visited it irregularly, not on any schedule, not on anniversaries, just when the particular weight of it found a moment in his week that had space for it. He would stand at the edge of the property, on the street side where the fence had been, and look at what remained, and let himself be in proximity to it for as long as the day allowed. 3 weeks after the roof, he arranged the demolition. He was there when it happened, standing where he always stood, watching the machine work through it with the systematic thoroughness that demolition machines bring to their subject. It took most of the morning. When it was finished, the lot was flat and clean, an empty rectangle of urban ground with no visible history. He stood there for a while after the crew left. Then he went back to his apartment, wrote 3 emails, and booked a flight to a city he had no particular reason to visit except that he had never been, which was reason enough. He left 4 days later with a bag that was not large and no fixed date of return. He sent a message to Park from the airport. It was brief and said approximately what it needed to say. Park read it at the gym, standing with his father's old towel over one shoulder, and typed back 3 words that were sufficient. Dong Yan passed his Athletic Association physical examination on the first attempt. His reconstructed knee registered within normal parameters for high-impact activity. The examiner noted his Muay Thai conditioning specifically in the supplementary comments, which was an unusual detail for a standard physical report, but reflected an unusual result. He enrolled in a regional sports program that had a track record of developing fighters toward national competition. The training schedule conflicted with his previous habits and required him to restructure his mornings significantly. He managed this without visible complaint, because visible complaint was not a communication style he had much use for. His first competitive bout was scheduled for late the following spring. Choi submitted her university application in the standard window. She did not discuss this with Jong Yun before filing, which he learned about afterward from Insu, who had heard it from a casual remark she made to Park. Jong Yun's reaction, when he processed the information, was the specific mixture of surprised pride and mild bewilderment that characterized most of his responses to her choices. He told Insu he thought it was great. Insu agreed it was great. They went back to what they were doing. She received her acceptance before the end of the month. Insu registered a business. It was a small freight brokerage, not ambitious in scale, not positioned toward rapid growth, but structured correctly and located in Incheon, where the maritime connections made the model viable. He brought 2 of his former crew in as co-founders, which gave the ownership table a particular character that most freight brokerages did not share but which worked, because the qualities that had made them a functional crew translated without much adjustment into what a small business under pressure required. The debt that Junwoo had cleared gave them a starting position without the drag that would have made the first year of operations impossible. They were careful with it, in the way that people are careful with something they understand the value of having been given. The business operated in the black by the 8th month. Insu sent Junwoo a message when that happened. It was brief and slightly formal in the way that Insu's written communication was always slightly formal. Junwoo replied the same day from somewhere that the timestamp suggested was several time zones away. Gubin Yang had been on the periphery of the Incheon resolution without being central to it. His reconciliation with Insu had occurred quietly, in a conversation that neither of them recounted with any specificity to anyone else. What was known was that he was present at the freight brokerage's registration filing and was listed on the paperwork. What happened with Donghua, who had sold out Gubin twice across the span of events, was that Donghua received the consequence that betrayals delivered for personal financial gain tend to receive when the financial gain fails to arrive: isolation, with no particular party motivated to intervene on his behalf. He was beaten, eventually, by people whose grievances were legitimate, and he collected nothing from either of the arrangements he had sold out his former partners to serve. Park began training formally. His father knew a coach, someone from the serious regional circuit who had watched the gym's fighters for 20 years and whose understanding of what a fighter needed was uncorrupted by the commercial incentives that had shaped the larger organizations. Park's father called in a debt that had been owed for 3 years to arrange a meeting. The coach watched Park work for 40 minutes and said almost nothing during it. At the end, he asked Park 2 questions: whether he was prepared to compete under his real name, with a real record attached to it, and whether he understood that the official competitive system would eventually require him to suppress the instincts that had been his primary tool, and replace them with something that could be governed by rules and judged by referees. Park said yes to both. The coach scheduled the first session for the following Monday at 6 in the morning, which was earlier than Park's previous habits required. He adjusted his morning accordingly. His father was at the gym when Park arrived for that first session. He had not been asked to come. He had simply arrived, at the kind of hour that the people who built gyms from nothing tend to keep. He sat on the bench along the wall where he had always sat, with a cup of coffee from the machine in the lobby, and watched his son begin. He did not offer corrections. He had finished correcting. He drank his coffee and watched, and the expression on his face was not one that Park looked at directly during the session, because some things you absorb from the periphery rather than confronting straight on. The gym had a particular smell in the early morning before other people arrived. Chalk and leather and the cold coming off the concrete floor, and Park had been breathing it for most of his life, and it meant more than he had vocabulary for, and he did not try to give it vocabulary. He worked the combinations his new coach called out. His hands were right. His footwork was still developing in the technical sense. The penetrating strike was not in the curriculum and would not appear in a bout under official rules, and he filed it away in the place where things are kept that belong to a specific chapter and do not need to be carried forward. The chapter was finished. He had done what the chapter required. He faced forward and worked.